Zoran Živković, the Violin-Maker. To the police inspector, it was an open and shut case. Mr. Tomasi, master violin-maker, had committed suicide by jumping from the window of the garret of the 3-story building where he lived and ran his celebrated workshop. The tragic incident was reported by 2 eyewitnesses, a baker's roundsman delivering bread and rolls who had been crossing the square early that morning. After hesitating a moment, they had fearfully approached the place where the unfortunate man lay. He showed no signs of life, even though they could not see any external injuries. Inspector Muratori quickly arrived at the scene of the incident and found out from the agitated young men, who had never seen death at first hand before, that nothing had heralded the falling body. They had heard no sounds before the dull thud on the sidewalk, which had frightened the pigeons at the little fountain in the middle of the square like a sudden detonation. Most suicides who take their lives by jumping from a height make their intentions known by shouting once they have stepped into the abyss, and it is too late to change anything. Only those who are firmly convinced that they are doing the right thing remain silent to the end. One glance at the 3-story building told Inspector Muratori where Mr. Tomasi had jumped from. The only open window was in the garret. Actually, he could have jumped off the roof, but there was no reason to choose such a steep, inaccessible place, since the window was much more suitable and served his purpose equally well. Although one might not expect that of a suicide, the policeman knew that they did not, as a rule, make their last moments more difficult than necessary. His examination of the inside of the house revealed nothing to conflict with the suicide hypothesis. On the contrary, when he climbed up to the garret that looked out on the square, the inspector found the door locked from the inside. This was a precautionary measure typical of someone who did not want to be deterred from carrying out his intention. The door had to be forced, because there was no way to push the key out of the lock so as to open it with a skeleton key. The small room was sparsely furnished, a table and 4 chairs, a single bed, a washstand with a basin and pitcher in the corner, a large mirror. There was no rug on the floor, no curtains at the window, no pictures on the walls. Mr. Umbertini, the tall, thin man in his late 20s, who was the late master violin-maker's assistant and lived alone with him in the house, explained that the garret was used exclusively for the final test of a new instrument. Mr. Tomasi would go inside and play there alone for some time. Then he would come out, either with a smile on his face, which meant that he was satisfied with his work, or with a handful of firewood and broken strings. Then it was best to stay away from him. The inspector's efforts, with the help of the visibly distressed Mr. Umbertini, to find a farewell letter that his master might have left somewhere, produced no results. This was not unusual. Those who did not actually want to kill themselves, even though they actually did in the end, were the most frequent writers of such messages. Determined suicides did not find it necessary to interpret or justify their actions to the world, or to make their farewells. By all appearances, Mr. Tomasi belonged to that category. Obviously, the man had been firmly resolved to take that step, and had set about it without hesitation. This case was one for the textbooks, clear and unambiguous. There was nothing more to investigate. The causes that had led the esteemed master violin-maker to commit suicide had not been established, but were of no interest to earthly justice. Let divine justice handle them, for it alone could know what had been on the suicide's mind. Inspector Murati ordered Mr. Umbertini to pack his things and leave the house, so that it could be sealed pending probate. For a moment, it seemed that the assistant wanted to make a comment or add something about this or some other matter, but he held back. That was just as well. Everything had already been said, and the policeman could by no means help the poor man who was suddenly out on the street. But Inspector Muratori had seen far worse fates. This fellow would manage. A man who had learned the violin-maker's trade under Maestro Tomasi need never be without an income. Such a recommendation would easily find him a job with another violin-maker, or he might even open his own shop. The experienced policeman was rarely mistaken in his conclusions about people and their fates, but he was wrong this time. Mr. Umbertini neither looked for new employment nor tried to set up making violins on his own. With the savings he'd been putting aside for years, he rented a small room in one of the narrow little streets off the square where he used to live. The rent was not high, because the room was partially below street level and quite humid. This did not bother him very much. In any event, he only went there to sleep. Mr. Umbertini spent most of his time in a tavern, not far from the maestro's house. He had not frequented the place before, primarily because he hadn't been the least inclined to drink, but also because it had a bad reputation as a hangout for the demi-monde. Now neither reason mattered. He started to drink. First moderately, just enough to feel slightly intoxicated, then more and more. He hardly felt when he crossed the line and became addicted. The tavern only served cheap, low-quality wines and spirits that made Mr. Umbertini's head ache for a long time after waking in his dirty basement bed. But that did not deter him from going there every day. At first, the other tavern regulars were suspicious of the new patron, avoiding his company. With his genteel manners and appearance, he was not part of their world. But as time passed and he became more and more like them in his person and behavior, they slowly started to warm to him. He no longer drank alone. They began to join him, until finally all the places at his table were occupied almost all the time. They were a motley collection, and just a few months ago he certainly could not have imagined himself among them. Frowning mercenaries from a regiment camped near the town, rotten-toothed and withered prostitutes, pickpockets on their way back from forays to the outdoor markets, tattered beggars, blemished and maimed. Although Mr. Umbertini had no desire to talk about the suicide with these people or anyone else, the topic could not be avoided once their relations with the former assistant to the celebrated violin-maker, by now a thoroughly unkempt drunk, became familiar enough to remove their inhibitions. Unlike the police, who found it unnecessary to delve into what had forced the maestro to suicide, this mystery had never stopped intriguing, prying minds, even in such a hole as this. Mr. Umbertini was subjected to a variety of approaches, from flattery through cajolery to threats, to get him to explain what had happened, but he withstood all such pressures without uttering a word. However, he could not avoid listening to the conjectures expounded by his fellow drinkers at the table in the tavern, through the dense, stale cigarette smoke and sharp smell of sour wine. One of the mercenaries, a man with a black patch over his left eye and a face full of scars, claimed that he had heard from a reliable source that a legacy of madness in the family lay behind it all. Mr. Tomasi's paternal grandfather, a carpenter from a nearby village, had also taken his life, but in a far better way. When his mind had gone black, he had shut himself in his workshop and started to stick every sharp tool he could find into his body. Not a single wound was fatal, but he died in prolonged agony from blood loss without uttering a single cry during that multiple, self-inflicted impalement. When his household forced their way into the workshop, they beheld a horrible sight. The carpenter's body on the floor, arms outstretched like some horizontal crucifixion, resembled a hedgehog with 33 quills sticking out of it. His wife, who was 5 months pregnant, had a miscarriage, and his only son, who was 4 at the time, was haunted his whole life by nightmares that made him wake up screaming. Mr. Umbertini could easily have refuted this awful story, but he didn't. In the early days of his apprenticeship, he had met the maestro's paternal grandfather. He had been a watch mender here in town and had died in his sleep at an advanced age from heart failure. He had outlived his wife by several years, leaving 7 children. The third of them, the first son after 2 daughters, was Mr. Tomasi's father, a cheerful and rather unruly man, certainly unburdened by dark stains from childhood, who died of suffocation on a fishbone, having been so incautious as to refill his mouth before he had finished laughing. Although not yet full grown, the younger of his 2 sons, Alberto, who had inherited his mother's fine ear for music, took over his father's workshop, where musical instruments were made and repaired. Not long afterwards, he narrowed his activities exclusively to making violins, and over time earned a reputation for his exceptional workmanship. One of the prostitutes, whose original beauty could still be discerned despite her dilapidated state, though she was barely over 30, had a completely different story. She had learned from someone completely trustworthy that the cause of Mr. Tomasi's suicide was unrequited love. A traveling circus had camped near the town the previous summer and given performances on the square. 3 musicians accompanied most of the acts, among them a young gypsy woman who played the violin. At first, the master violin-maker had complained about the noisy disturbance every evening in front of his house, but when he saw and heard the girl, he became more cordial. He went to the window evening after evening and pretended to watch the events on the square, but never actually took his eyes off the young gypsy. Finally, he went up to her at the end of a show, bringing the best instrument he had ever made. He invited her to his house and proposed that she play this violin for him alone during the coming night, promising to pay her generously in return. The girl whispered briefly to one of the other 2 musicians and then accepted. When she left Mr. Tomasi's house the next morning, she was carrying the precious instrument wrapped in brown felt. The next evening, the master violin-maker waited impatiently on the terrace for the customary circus performance, but no one appeared. In the meantime, the traveling show had decamped and continued on its way. Mr. Tomasi hired a horse at daybreak and set out in frantic search for them. He went to many of the nearby towns without finding a trace of the entertainers. The earth seemed to have swallowed them up. Completely crushed, he had been forced to give up in the end. He returned home, hoping that time would heal his wounds, and he would somehow forget the beautiful violinist, but he couldn't get over her. He fell into deeper and deeper depression, slowly losing the will and ability to make any more instruments. Finally, sunk into total despair, he decided to end his suffering. The late master violin-maker's assistant knew from the outset that this story hadn't a grain of truth, but he didn't say so, among other things so as not to ruin the woman's pleasurable excitement as she recounted her tale. There was, in truth, a sad tale of love in the violin-maker's life, but it dated from his much younger days, while he was still learning the skills of his trade. Love blossomed between him and a close cousin on his mother's side. Although forbidden and clandestine, it was tempestuous, as often happens at that age. Who knows how things might have ended had illness not intervened? The girl came down with galloping tuberculosis and died only a few weeks later. He never became attached to a single woman after that, although he did not renounce them. He tried to be as inconspicuous as possible when he slaked his urges, usually going to other towns for that purpose. One of the pickpockets, a man with long, clever fingers, but a face that was the very incarnation of innocence, swore on his honor that he had first-hand knowledge about the real reason why Mr. Tomasi had killed himself. It was because of a huge gambling loss he had suffered. The violin-maker had been in the clutches of this obsession for some time, although no one knew anything about it, not even his assistant, who lived under the same roof. A group of gamblers used to meet secretly at his house every Friday, going up to the garret, from which he had finally jumped to his death. They would cover the window with the blanket from the bed so no one from outside suspected anything, and then the game that would start by candlelight often lasted until dawn. As an honorable man, the violin-maker had been convinced that his companions were his equals in integrity. He had not the slightest inkling that he had fallen into a network of shrewd and unscrupulous cheats. At first they bet small amounts, and he mostly won. Then Lady Luck suddenly turned her back on him. He started losing, not only his money, but his common sense. He agreed to increase the bets in the futile hope that he would win back what he had lost, but he only sank deeper and deeper into debt. When his cash and valuables disappeared, he started to write IOUs. First he lost his large estate in the country, then his house in town. He still managed to hold up somehow, but when the cards took away the last of his expensive instruments, he realized he had hit rock bottom. In the end he caught on, realizing he had been the victim of a hoax, but there was no turning back. Unable to live with the thought that his violins were in the hands of cunning thieves, he sentenced himself to the ultimate punishment. That was pure invention, of course, but Mr. Umbertini still made no comment. Gambling organized every Friday, however discreetly, would never have escaped his attention. Moreover, Mr. Tomasi had never had a country estate to lose. Far more important than these details, however, was the fact that gambling was the last vice to which the maestro would have succumbed, without ever being touched by it personally. He had experienced the grievous consequences of this addiction. The violin-maker's older brother, Roberto Tomasi, had been a regular attender at large casinos since he was a young man. He had left his share of their father's inheritance in them long ago, but for some time afterwards continued to gratify this irresistible vice thanks to his brother's generous support. Alberto had shown a strange compassion for Roberto's weakness, agreeing to pay his gambling debts, until one day he refused to give him the large amount he had come for. Thereupon Roberto had, in a fit of rage, seized a newly finished violin and smashed it against the wall. The two brothers never saw each other again after that, even though the older brother had sent many letters of apology and even gone to plead at his younger brother's door. A crippled beggar, who claimed to be the illegitimate son of a duke, patiently listened to all three stories, and announced self-confidently that none of them was true. The master violin-maker had not committed suicide at all, whatever thought. He did not jump from the window, he was thrown out of it. There was a third eyewitness to this tragedy, as well as the two baker's men. He was a beggar who had left town in a hurry immediately after the fateful event, fearing what he had seen, and pausing only long enough to confide in his lame friend. The beggar had spent the night on the square and was sleeping under some stairs when he was awakened at daybreak by banging from somewhere above. He looked around drowsily, then realized that the noise was coming from the open window in the garret of the violin-maker's house. It seemed as if someone was trying to break something in there, but he could see nothing from below. Then everything quieted down, and a brief silence reigned. Just as the two baker's boys arrived in the square from a side street, each carrying baskets full of freshly baked bread and rolls, the terrified maestro appeared at the window. He held tightly onto the frame, trying to resist whoever was pushing him from behind. It was a silent struggle, which was why the young men were completely unaware of it. They crossed the square, unsuspecting among the pigeons, chatting in low voices. The unrelenting pressure on the maestro's back grew stronger and stronger until his resistance yielded. As if hurled by a huge hand, he flew out of the window and plunged helplessly towards the pavement, still without uttering a sound. Behind him, however, the window was not empty, as it would have been had he jumped of his own free will. A terrifying figure appeared for just an instant, curdling the blood in the observer's veins as he lay hidden under the stairs. It disappeared at once, but that fleeting look was enough for the beggar to recognize it beyond all doubt. He remained hidden for quite some time, not daring to move. It was only after the police inspector had completed his investigation and the dead man's body was removed that the beggar mustered the courage to come out. It should surprise no one, the lame beggar concluded didactically, that Mr. Tomasi finally fell victim to the tempter. Anyone who pledges his soul to the devil for the sake of some vain and evanescent acclaim must be assured that the devil will get his due, sooner or later. The master violin-maker had no reason to complain. He had gloried for many years in his reputation as the unsurpassed creator of magnificent violins, although it was clear to everyone that such talent could not be natural. That was when Mr. Umbertini was first tempted to contribute a comment of his own. Unlike the other stories, this one was at least partially credible. The storyteller himself had probably been the eyewitness on the square that morning, rather than this nameless friend who had so conveniently disappeared. Most likely he was reluctant to admit it, so as to avoid being questioned by the police. But he had given too many convincing details for one who was merely recounting another's experience. The supplementary parts which he had invented were understandable in the circumstances. Without them, his story would not have been exciting enough for the listeners in the tavern. On the other hand, although he could not have known, they were not completely unfounded. Nonetheless, the ex-assistant decided once again not to say anything, principally because of his unwillingness to enter into the inevitable discussion about this aspect of the maestro's accident, for the secret at its heart greatly surpassed his own understanding. He might never have spoken about it at all, had his hand not been forced by an extraordinary chain of events. The vagabonds and good-for-nothings who kept him company in the tavern started to lose interest in the violin-maker's suicide, as it became clear they would get nothing out of his former assistant. They also found the man himself less and less interesting, since he passed most of his time withdrawn into gloomy silence, concentrating on the bottle. They gradually started to drop away, finally leaving him alone at the table. At last, only the large, bearded innkeeper sometimes exchanged a word or two with him. One rainy day in late autumn, Mr. Umbertini arrived at the tavern early, while there were still no other guests. He sat at a small table with 2 chairs in the corner, close to the hearth, and the innkeeper, without asking, and giving just a brief nod, brought him 3 bottles of red wine and a glass. He peered briefly at his customer's thin, unshaven face, inflamed eyes and red nose, but said nothing. The innkeeper couldn't care less about the appearance of those who frequented his establishment, as long as they had money to pay for what they ordered. It was not his job to warn immoderate drunks that every new glass only shortened what little life they had remaining. He picked up the coins that Mr. Umbertini put on the table without a word, and slipped them in the deep pocket under his stained apron, then went behind the bar. Mr. Umbertini was already halfway through the 2nd bottle when new guests started to appear in the tavern. They were certainly not those he was accustomed to seeing there. First, a little boy came in. He could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old, but he went up to the largest table, sat at the head, took out a piece of paper and pen from somewhere, bowed his head, and started to write something in a tiny script. From time to time he took out a handkerchief and held it briefly to his nose. After him came a middle-aged woman, holding a bunch of rolled-up scrolls under her arm. She sat next to the boy, unrolled a scroll, and became engrossed in reading. The refined-looking older man who soon joined them brought a snow-white cat with him. He stroked it gently in his lap, whispering in its ear. The older woman who next arrived stood at the entrance, looking in bewilderment, first at the innkeeper, and then at the master violin-maker's assistant, as though she had seen ghosts. She sat down stiffly on one of the 3 unoccupied chairs, and put her muff on the table in front of her without taking her hands out of it. The man who came in after her was a painter. As soon as he joined the others, he opened a large sketching block, took a stick of charcoal, and started sketching in brisk, rough strokes. Finally, the last to arrive was a rather casually dressed man with disheveled gray hair. He rummaged through his pockets for a few moments, finally found a piece of chalk, and without the least hesitation began to write on the uncovered wooden table, erasing something here and there with the leather-patched elbow of his jacket. The sight of 6 such strangers at the big table was extremely unusual in this establishment. During all the months that Mr. Umbertini had spent in the tavern, he had never seen anyone even slightly resembling them. But what seemed to him almost as unbelievable was the fact that the innkeeper paid them absolutely no attention. He, who took great pains that no guest was ever left even momentarily without a glass or a plate on the table in front of him, who kept an eye on empty glasses in order to fill them at once, and never recoiled from showing the door to anyone who contemplated sitting inside for free, had not even approached these dignified guests, although they clearly promised a good tab. Instead, he went up to the assistant's table, waved at the other chair with the dirty rag he constantly wore over his arm, and sat down. He came straight to the point. He maintained that he knew why Mr. Tomasi had killed himself, a most unexpected statement, as he had never taken part in the conversations on the subject. He had seemed totally uninterested, just idly listening to the stories told by others. The master violin-maker, the innkeeper now asserted, had wanted to make a perfect violin. He had invested years of effort, and everything indicated that he was on the right track. Unfortunately, no human hands, not even the most gifted, are able to reach perfection. Although appearing perfect in every way, the violin was nonetheless not divine, as he had hoped. When he realized this after testing it that morning, the violin-maker understood that there was only one way out of this defeat, and he took it. This time Mr. Umbertini could hold back no longer. Had the innkeeper's story simply been wrong, he certainly would not have reacted, gliding over it as he had the others. But he had found one essential aspect of this story deeply offensive, and only he could now stand up to defend the maestro's besmirched honor. That was a debt he owed his teacher, and it rose above the pledge the assistant had made to himself never to reveal what had happened in the garret. The innkeeper had been right, although Mr. Umbertini could not even imagine how that simple and greedy seller of bad wine could have found out something which the maestro had kept secret, even from his faithful pupil. For 18 years, with endless devotion and patience, he had indeed been working on a perfect violin. It was only towards the end that the assistant finally understood what lay hidden behind the violin-maker's periodic retreats to the highest room in the house. He would stay locked inside for hours, although he had taken no instrument with him to test, and no one dared to disturb him. The innkeeper, however, was wrong when he said, with an edge of malice in his voice, that the master violin-maker had been unsuccessful in his efforts. Sneaking up to the garret on that fateful morning, when the unique violin was given its final test, Mr. Umbertini heard the sound of divine harmony for the first and only time in his life. Even though the closed door dampened the music, the magic of that experience had been so powerful that he had felt compelled to stay close to the maestro's house instead of going somewhere else, where he might hope to enjoy a more useful and fulfilling life, even though he was conscious that he would never again be given an opportunity to hear it. Mr. Umbertini knew the question the innkeeper would ask next, just as he knew that it had no answer. If the maestro had truly created a perfect violin, what had happened to it? Or to its remains, if the crashing that the beggar on the square had heard meant that the maestro had broken it? Although why would he do such a thing to his masterpiece? When the inspector had forced the door, nothing was found inside, neither a whole instrument nor its wreckage. So there must have been a secret entrance into the garret, concluded the cunning innkeeper, which the assistant had used before the inspector's arrival in order to remove all traces. This was a logical assumption that offered an explanation for both possibilities, that the violin had been perfect and that it hadn't been. Its only defect was that it was incorrect. There was no secret entrance to the highest room in the building. When he finally entered the garret with the inspector, the assistant encountered his second wonder of that morning. Although the instrument had to be there, and in one piece, it was not. And the fact that it should have been in one piece constituted the first wonder. As Mr. Umbertini stood in front of the door, still dazzled by the music that had just ended, he suddenly heard something inside that terrified him. He was quite familiar with that sound. The crashing could mean only one thing. The master violin-maker was destroying his life's work. But why? Not knowing what else to do, the assistant quickly dropped to his knees and tried to peer inside through the keyhole. Had there been no key in the lock, he could have seen more. But even this way he was able to catch at least partial sight of the maestro's crazed figure as he swung the violin, holding it by the neck. He hit it against whatever he found, the table, chair back, bed frame, walls. Even though the full force of his unbridled rage went into it, the instrument was not the least scratched. The violin steadfastly resisted all his attempts to shatter it, remaining untouched, as though he was merely swinging it through the air. When he threw it to the floor and started to jump on it, again without damaging it, he finally collapsed, sat on the edge of the bed, thrust his head in his hands, and stayed there without moving for a while. And then he got up slowly, went to the large window, grabbed the frame, stayed in that position a few moments, then let go of his hands and simply leaned forward. The dumbfounded assistant took his eye off the keyhole and slid to the floor next to the door. It was not until the inspector banged the knocker on the front door of the house that he was startled out of his paralysis. The innkeeper shook his head. Of all the stories he had heard, he said, this one seemed the most far-fetched. Thank heavens Mr. Umbertini had not told it to the police, because that would surely have focused suspicion on himself. He personally still thought that the only true explanation lay in the secret entrance. As far as the noise was concerned, it didn't have to come from breaking the violin. Rather, its maker might have banged the furniture around him in frustration over his failure, as people do when they are infuriated. In any case, the innkeeper concluded, after the master violin-maker jumped through the window, Mr. Umbertini had gone into the garret and stowed the instrument somewhere. He had waited for the situation to calm down, then sold it under the counter. The violin might not have been perfect according to Mr. Tomasi's criteria, but the seller certainly would have received a pretty sum from it that would enable him to lead a comfortable life. For example, he could amuse himself at the tavern day after day without having to work. But Mr. Umbertini had no need to worry. The innkeeper certainly would not turn him in. What benefit would that bring him? He would only be losing a regular customer who had never asked for credit. Seeing there was nothing more to say, he returned to the bar. He started to wipe glasses idly, continuing to neglect the 6 visitors at the other table. They sat there briefly, involved in their preoccupations, and then, as though at an invisible signal, stood up and left the tavern together, probably offended at being so rudely ignored. Mr. Umbertini watched them leave, and then, as though remembering something, quickly got up and headed after them, leaving almost a bottle and a half of wine, paid for but not drunk. He was never seen in there again. For a while, stories were concocted in the tavern regarding his disappearance. It was heard with great reliability that thieves had slaughtered him and thrown him into the river, that he had left for the New World to seek his fortune, that he had opened his own workshop in another town, and that he had come down with leprosy and was now living the miserable remainder of his days in an asylum on some island. Only the sober innkeeper, who was not to be cheated, knew that they were all fabrications, and that, as usual, the simplest explanation was the soundest. The late master violin-maker's assistant had fled, fearing that someone might denounce him to the police after he had spent all of his dishonestly acquired money.